Hey everyone, it's Mark. Today I'm going to be covering how to fly in the mountains in Flight Sim 2020. Flying in the backcountry is one of my most enjoyable things that I like to do in the game because you get to see varied terrain and it isn't too hard on your video card either. But flying in the backcountry is a very different skill set from what you would need to know to fly in a normal urban area. For that reason, I've collected a bunch of recommendations and suggestions that I found online in regards to how to make your ventures in the backcountry a little bit more realistic and fun. Any of the tips and suggestions I give here apply only to the game. Please don't apply them in real life. That brings me to my first suggestion before I even get into the cockpit, and that's that before you try and fly anywhere in the backcountry or in a bush trip, that you should learn how to fly the airplane in normal conditions first. The middle of a mountain, even a simulated one, isn't the place to learn how a plane operates. That's especially true when it comes to the bush trips that come as part of the game. Any mistake and any crash on one of the bush trip legs is going to result in a failure, and you'll have to fly the whole leg over again, and it can be a little bit frustrating when you just want to progress to the next leg. Specifically, you should probably be looking at practicing your takeoff and landing technique, how to do steep turns in the airplane, how to handle the plane during those steep turns, as well as how to enter and exit slow flight. These are all skills you're going to need in the backcountry to be able to do a safe and proper landing. If you need some more ideas on how to familiarize yourself with a new airplane, make sure to check out my previous video that I did on the topic. I'll add a link to it right up here. Before I go any further, if you get any value out of this video, please make sure to hit the like and subscribe button. As usual, if you have any comments or feedback, feel free to put them in the comments box below and I'll get back to you once I can. Once you're in the cockpit, there's a few things to check out before taxi and takeoff. I've already started the engines and done most of the pre-flight checks, but one thing that I am going to do first is just double check what I've set as the weather. In this case, I've got it set to the clear skies preset, so obviously there won't be any issues at all with weather along my route, but if you're using live weather, it could definitely be a factor. Winds of over 20 knots, even in a fairly large plane like the Cessna Caravan, can pose a little bit of a challenge, because what's going to happen is the wind is going to flow over the mountain. As the wind comes over the ridge right here, it's going to do exactly like water and flow down, which could cause you problems as we're taking off. With the weather checks out of the way, the next thing is to figure out which runway you're going to be taking off. Most of the time, just as usual, that's going to be the runway that's facing into the wind. There is one notable exception to that rule, and that's if the runway has a slope to it. When there's a slope to the runway, what you're going to want to do, generally speaking, is to take off on the downhill and land on the uphill. There are a few exceptions to that, of course, and winds are a factor as well. The rule of thumb that I've seen online is that if the wind is more than about 10% of your takeoff speed, that you should consider taking off uphill even if there is a very slight incline. For places like in the landing challenges where there's a huge incline, you would obviously always take off downhill and land uphill, because otherwise you would never be able to get off the ground. In this situation, since the winds are light and the recommended departure is runway 1, and I'm already on runway 1, I'll just be taking off from this end of the runway. Now, I mentioned earlier that you also need to take into account the weight of the airplane. If your plane weighs too much and the runway is just too short, it's entirely possible you won't be able to get off the runway at all. And that's regardless of anything else you might do to improve your takeoff distance, like using your short field takeoff procedure. The rule of thumb that I use is pretty simple. All you gotta do is figure out the halfway point of the runway and calculate what 70% of your takeoff speed is gonna be. In the Caravan, the rotation speed is 75 knots, which means that my 70% airspeed is going to be around 52 knots or so. That means that if I reach the halfway point of the runway and I haven't reached that 52 knot airspeed, I'm going to abort my takeoff because there's just no way that I'm going to get off the ground in time. Usually what I will do is I'll switch to the drone camera and I'll try and find the halfway point by finding some kind of marker that I can use on my takeoff roll that I'll be able to tell when I've gone past the 50% mark. In this case, this airport really doesn't have much in terms of landmarks for me to use. So I'm gonna have to sort of eyeball it about when these trees sort of come back towards the runway here. I think that's about the 50% mark right there. So I'm gonna keep an eye on that as I'm doing my takeoff roll, and if I get to this point right here where the trees come back towards the runway and I haven't reached my 52 knots, I'm gonna abort my takeoff. And in a situation where I did not have enough space to take off, all I would do is I would come back into my fuel and I would either reduce the amount of fuel if I wasn't going on a long flight or reduce my payload a little bit more. In this case, I've only got about 50% fuel and a very light payload, so it's not going to be a problem. Alright, at this point I am ready to taxi to the end of the runway for takeoff. I might skip right to there just because really you won't really see much other than me maneuvering around these pushback guys, which in the real world would definitely not be there at such a small airfield. The first thing to do when you're getting ready for takeoff is to make sure that you've given yourself as much space as possible on the runway. In this case, you can see I backed myself up a little bit more than usual. I used slew mode to get myself here, so I did cheat a little bit, but it's going to give me the maximum amount of space on the runway, and in a situation where the runway is short like this one, it's never a bad idea. Lastly, if you're in a propeller-based plane, before takeoff, you're going to want to make sure to lean the engine with the mixture control before takeoff so that you maximize the amount of power that the engine is going to develop on your takeoff roll. The Cessna is a turboprop, so I don't need to worry about that myself, but any propeller-based plane, you'll definitely want to lean the mixture as appropriate. Lastly, you're going to want to familiarize yourself with the short field configuration for your airplane. In my case, I know that the best takeoff speed for this airplane is 75 knots and that I should do it with a single level of flaps. If I were in a situation where there really wasn't much runway at all, I would probably go full flaps just to generate as much lift as possible, but in this case, it's not necessary. So I'm going to head off now, and I'm hopefully going to avoid that petrol truck on the side, which I'm not quite sure what it's doing. So I'm going to apply my power first. I'm going to let the power build up in the engine a little bit, and then I'm going to release the parking brake just to optimize how much runway it's going to take to get up to my airspeed. So again, I am keeping an eye out for where the trees come back in towards the runway there. If I haven't made it to 52 by that point, and in this case I would have aborted the takeoff, but in this situation I'm fine. So I'm going to continue to my takeoff, and once I get to 75, I'm going to rotate. There we go. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to adjust my pitch to hold 75 knots, which is going to be my VX airspeed, which is the airspeed that's going to give me the best angle of climb in the airplane. I'm going to use 75 knots until I get up to a safe altitude where I feel I'm far enough away from all these mountains, and then I'm going to accelerate to VY. VY is going to give me the best rate of climb so that I can get out of these hills and up to my cruise altitude as fast as possible. If you want a refresher on how to use VX and VY for your takeoffs, make sure to check out my previous video that I did on the topic. I cover pretty much anything you would want to know about VX, VY, and also the cruise climb airspeed for your airplane. As I continue my climb up to my cruise altitude, there's a few things that I'm going to keep in mind to keep my flight as smooth as possible. So the first thing is you're obviously going to want to be aware at all times of which direction the wind is coming. In my case, the winds are very light, so it's not a huge factor, but even still, I'm going to keep an eye on it as I'm traveling through these different mountain ridges so that I can adjust accordingly. You always want to try and stay on the upwind side of the ridges so that you avoid any wind coming off the other side of the ridge, which is going to affect your airplane. In this case, because I'm just getting out of the canyon, I don't have much of a choice but to be on the south side of the ridge, but in general you should try and avoid it as much as possible. The other thing to keep in mind is if you do have to cross any ridges, you should do it at about a 45-degree angle. Try and avoid crossing a mountain ridge straight on, mostly because it's going to give you an option to abort if suddenly you see that the wind is too strong and there's strong downdrafts. You'll have a lot easier time turning around and heading back to the upwind side of the ridge if you come at it at a 45-degree angle versus if you were flying directly at it. The other thing is obviously you should avoid entering any canyons that you don't know if there is an exit to them. It can be a lot of fun, obviously, to fly into a canyon, but the worst thing that can happen is if you end up in a canyon and there's no easy way out and you're too low and you can't escape and you crash, you'll have to start your whole flight over again. So I am just going to continue to my cruise altitude, which is at around 11,000 feet. And once I've cleared the mountains, I'm going to head back towards my flight path. And what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to skip ahead a little bit to the landing of my flight. There isn't much to see between here and there since I'm just going to be flying above the mountain ridges. The one exception to the don't enter a canyon rule is obviously when you're coming in for landing. At this airport, I'm not in a canyon, but as you can see, there are mountains all around. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to fly over the airfield so that I get an idea of what I'm dealing with and how I'm going to fly my traffic pattern. Ideally, I want to fly it as normally as possible. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go around the mountain that we see on the right to come and do a left-hand traffic pattern down to the airfield that's just below. I'm also planning my go around so that if I don't make it down, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn right and I'm going to try and loop around to be able to come back and make another attempt at my landing. As much as possible, you want to fly a normal traffic pattern. In this case, I'm pretty sure going around the mountain isn't exactly standard procedure, but in the game, because we are pretty safe and we're not putting anyone's lives at risk, I think it's alright. The other thing to keep in mind as you are landing in the backcountry is to be aware if there's any slope at the runway that you're landing at, and if there is, you likely want to land on the uphill slope. Obviously, you'll have to take into account the winds, and that will affect your choice for landing as well. But generally speaking, you'll want to be landing on the uphill slope. The other thing as well to keep in mind is that you want to use your short field landing technique. So you're going to want to know what the configuration for the plane should be to do a short field landing in the backcountry. In my case, I know that I need to be at full flaps, so once I turn out on final here, I'm going to extend those last little bits of flaps just to slow the airplane down some more and continue my descent down. The other two important parts are to have as stable of an approach as possible and to control your airspeed the whole way down to the runway. So I'm trying to get to 85 knots for my final approach, so I'm going to reduce power a little bit. And I'm using a slightly steeper descent rate so that if there were any trees near the bottom of the runway, I could have easily gotten above them and come in for my landing still fairly safely. So I'm looking quite good now on final. My airspeed's a little slower than I would have liked, but that's okay. It just means it'll take us less space to land once we actually touch down. Just gonna hold it straight right there. I'm gonna drop my power to neutral, and there we go. And now all I have to do is just hold the brakes down to come to a complete stop. So that's all I wanted to look at today for landing in the backcountry and taking off in the backcountry. If you have any questions or comments, or you just want to criticize my landing technique, please feel free to do so in the comments below. Otherwise, please make sure to hit like and subscribe if you got some value out of this video. And otherwise, I'll see you next time.